Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday at 8 p.m. Eastern and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's Torah portion is Vayetze. It starts with Jacob having an iconic dream of a ladder joining heaven to earth. By tradition, to the holiest place on earth, the Temple Mount. But we also find a foreshadowing of the third holiest site in Jerusalem, in Judaism. Join us on the side of the road as we explore Rachel and her tomb. Mother Rachel, come to me. Well, welcome. So I do look every so often at what we talked about last year. And last year we talked about Hamakom, the place. So
that was a good one last year.
Yeah, that was a point of departure. But before we get into this, you know, there were so many times, and I referred to Rachel's tomb as the third holiest place in Judaism, and the Temple Mount, where that ladder between heaven and earth is traditionally supposed to have stood. Do you believe, is it universally accepted that we have the temple, and then there's Kever Machpelah is number 2, and Rachel's tomb is number 3?
I'll just tell you the following. There's no question historically that the Temple Mount is where the Temple Mount always was. And there's also no question that the cave of Machpelah is where the cave of Machpelah always was. We actually have an unbroken tradition that people always visited the cave of Machpelah. For many hundreds of years, it was the Muslims who visited the cave of Machpelah, which is not surprising because they share at least Abraham with us. So they visited the cave of Machpelah. The tombstone of Rachel is open for debate. There are different traditions about exactly where Rachel is buried. So we follow the tradition that she's buried there in Beit Lechem on the way to Ephrat. But actually, there's another tradition in the prophets that she's buried somewhere else. So that tradition is number 3, but that's not entirely clear how that tradition falls.
So it is kind of interesting that we'll see in a few minutes that she was buried on the side of the road. And so in a sense, it was a little bit like Moses, where it was kind of an unmarked grave. So it's not exactly surprising that we don't know the exact location. But I jump ahead of myself. I did want to say that, you know, many times I read the New York Times and other periodicals and newspapers, and when there's a problem or a situation on Har HaBayit, the Temple Mount, they will typically say that the Temple Mount is the third holiest place in Judaism. And the last time I saw it, it says, and there were 2 temples there. It almost made me feel like there was New Israel of Flatbush and Temple Emmanuel were there. There were 2 temples there. You know, it's really amazing how we've kind of lost that narrative, because anyone who reads the Bible, you know, whether we want another temple or not is a whole other discussion. But so much of it is based on the temple ritual. The Leviticus is all about the temple cult. And even if, you know, read Christianity, where Jesus threw over the money changer tables in front of the temple. I mean, it was such a core part of Judaism. It really it becomes like an afterthought many times when it's mentioned. And that's just amazing to me.
That absolutely is amazing. I mean, that's more a comment about the New York Times than, you know, and journalism today, but that is an amazing point. Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if it's only them, but I thought I should mention that. And I must say that we Jews, and we're going to get into this a little bit, you know, we're not that holy space oriented. I mean, how many times have you been to, for instance, Kever Rachel? Or I think I was there. I hardly remember if I was. The Kotel, my wife loves to go, but you know, to me, Judaism and holiness is not so based on a.
You're not a big Kotel person either, are you?
I'm not. You know, I always think of that cynical Zionist thinker who said when we got the Kotel, they're going to put some lights on it and it's going to become the discotel. But anyway, here we are, and we're in Genesis. And what I want to do is, even though the story of Rachel dying and being buried on the side of the road is a parsha or two ahead of us. As I said, it's foreshadowed here. And so what we have, and you're going to talk about it this coming Shabbat, is this question of the switch between Leah and Rachel under the wedding canopy. And I am going to talk about 2 or 3 episodes in our parsha where there is a little bit of foreshadowing of what was going to be unique about both Rachel and then possibly what's unique about her burial. So in Genesis 29:25, it says, when morning came, meaning the morning after Jacob thought he was being married to Rachel, oops, there was Leah. So he said to Laban, "What is this you have done to me? I was in your service for Rachel. Why did you deceive me?" And Rashi quotes the Midrashic interpretation, which says that at night he didn't realize it was not Leah. He didn't realize it wasn't Rachel, because Jacob had given Rachel certain secret signs by which they could at all times recognize one another. And when Rachel saw that they were about to bring Leah to him for the marriage ceremony, she thought, "My sister may now be put to shame," and she therefore readily transmitted these signs to her. So here in this version of the story, and we might see that there were other versions, first of all, Jacob was aware of what could happen. Rachel was aware of what could happen. They knew the cast of characters. And Jacob took the initiative and says, "Make this certain sign, and I'll know it's you, even if you're under the tightest veil that could be." And she, at the last minute, had pity on her sister, who would thereby be embarrassed, and she gave the signs to her sister. So I think from this perspective, this is something that's kind of complementary to Rachel. Would you not think? I mean, it says we have this, this concept of embarrassing somebody, and here Rachel comes and puts that before everything else.
There's no question that Midrashic tradition defends Rachel. It makes Rachel the righteous one.
And as I was thinking about it, and I was actually talking to my wife about this earlier today, if you think about the role that women have taken so far in Genesis, I mean, if it wasn't for Eve, we'd still be sitting contemplating nirvana in Gan Eden. If it wasn't for Sarah, it would have been Ishmael, probably not Isaac. The same goes for Rivka. There's one thing that gets attributed to the women, are matriarchs, more than anything else. It's this decisive action. I think that's kind of fascinating, isn't it?
Very fascinating. And here in this week's parsha, you have the same thing. Even though it's a little less clear with Rachel and Leah exactly who does good and what everybody is doing, it's not entirely clear.
We're going to see in a second that it gets a little murky. So later in the parsha, in Genesis 30, Reuben, one of the sons, one of Leah's children, is out in the field, and he brings some mandrakes, which I understand are maybe an aphrodisiac, to his mom. And Rachel said to her, "Was it not that you take away my husband, that you would also take my son's mandrakes?" So Rachel asks for the mandrakes, and Leah accuses her. You have my husband. He loves you more. He sleeps with you, and now you want the mandrakes too. And Rachel replied, "I promise he shall lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." So she, in a way, parlays the mandrakes. I guess she wants this aphrodisiac because she's having issues bearing a child. And she trades that for a night with her husband. And Rashi comments on this, saying, because she thought lightly of companionship with so righteous a man, she was not privileged to be buried together with him. So now already we're seeing Rashi bringing up Midrashim, who are starting to pin the blame on Rachel and explain why she deserved to be buried on the side of the road. What do you make of this?
Yeah, that's interesting. Meaning that she she's punished. You see, that's why I'm saying it's murky. The other thing that's murky is about Leah. Leah seems to kind of be snobby towards Rachel because she has 4 children and then 6 children, and Rachel has no children. And it seems like Rachel, is helpless, but Leah doesn't seem to care. So that's also a problem with the whole story. The role of Rachel and Leah seems to go back and forth and back.
Absolutely. But where was Leah buried? Did she end up getting buried?
Leah was buried in the cave of Machpelah.
Okay, so that is kind of interesting. But where we don't need to go to the Midrash anymore, we go now to Genesis 31:19. So Jacob has worked another 7 years, and he's got nothing. He's got 2 beautiful wives. He's got 11 kids at that time.
11. One comes next week.
That's right. And he says, I need something to Laban. He says, give me something for all these years. And they come up with this scheme of, long story short, he works out so that he has enough to move out of the house. And as he's leaving, meanwhile, Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel stole her father's household idols. So they're packing up to leave, and Rachel takes her father's idols. And then, as I even intimated last week, Laban catches up with them as they head to the border. And he accuses Jacob of a lot of things, including, he says, why did you steal my gods? And in pure, if I knew my Greek mythology better, I would know who to refer to. But Jacob says, but anyone with whom you find your gods shall not remain alive. He is so sure that no one in his camp would have stolen these teraphim, these household idols, that he swears that whoever stole them will die.
And of course, he's predicting that Rachel will die.
Sure. As Rashi says, in consequence of this curse, Rachel died on the journey. And that's not Rashi. He's quoting Genesis Rabbah. So here we have it. There are all of a sudden all of this foreboding stuff, which is blaming Rachel for certain things, and in a sense trying to explain what happens at the end, which is in a next week's parsha, I guess, Genesis 35, as they set out to Bethel, some distance short of Ephrat. Rachel was in childbirth and she had hard labor. And of course, we know hard labor, it brings us back to Eve, who was cursed to have hard labor because of her sin. When her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, have no fear, for it is another boy for you. It goes on to say, thus Rachel died. She was buried on the road to Ephrat, B'derech Ephratah, now Bethlehem, says the Torah. So it's saying, even up to this day, over her grave, Jacob set up a pillar. It is the pillar at Rachel's grave to this day, ad hayom. So here we have full circle. We start the parsha with Yaakov falling to sleep on a bunch of stones. Then the stones become one. We have all that midrash. He wakes up and he finds out it's a holy place. That's the holiest place. That's where the temple was built. And here we have in our parsha the foreshadowing of an event where Rachel will be buried on the side of a road. You could say in an unmarked grave, but it is marked, and it's marked.
Yeah, it does. It doesn't say unmarked, right? It's a marked grave.
It's marked, and it goes out of its way to say that it was marked by Jacob with a pillar. And the interesting thing is the midrashim say that each of Jacob's sons took a stone and put it on the grave. 11 stones for the 11 tribes. And then Jacob went ahead and put a stone on top, a larger stone, and these were the 12 stones. So you almost have this same type of correspondence, if you will, to making the site of the temple holy. Here they make the site of Rachel's tomb holy.
Right.
So I was always kind of interested, and I kind of piqued my curiosity about what became so special about Rachel's tomb that gave it such a high of a profile. The interesting thing is, if you go a little bit further on, we start to get into the pathos. So when Jacob is asking Joseph to make sure he is buried in the land, it's an amazing pasuk. It says "Va'ani" with a major stop. He said, "I." And then it goes on. When I was returning from Padam, Rachel died to my sorrow while I was journeying in the land of Canaan. When still some distance short of Ephrat, I buried her there on the road to Ephrat, now Bethlehem. So Jacob in his old age, when he's asking Joseph to promise him to bury him in the land of Israel, he does this kind of confession. And Rashi beautifully fills in the blanks. He says, I know that in your heart you feel some resentment against me, Jacob is saying to Joseph. Know, however, that I buried her there by the command of God. And the future proved that God had commanded him to do this in order that she might help her children when Nebuchadnezzar would take them into captivity. So now all of a sudden we have two themes. One is the guilt and the pathos that Jacob feels for not burying his wife in the Kever HaMachpelah that his grandfather Abraham bought for Sarah. And the other is saying that God commanded him to do this because Rachel has a specific mission. She would be there as the exiled Jews were leaving the land of Israel going to Babylonia. And of course, that hearkens to Jeremiah 31, which says, thus said the Lord, a cry is heard in Ramah, wailing, bitter weeping. Rachel weeping for her children, she refuses to be comforted. Rachel mivaka al baneha. And then it says at the end that declares God, they shall return from the enemy's land, and there is hope for our future. V'yesh tikva la'achritech ne'um Adonai, v'shuvu vanim ligvulam, and your children shall return to their country. So all of a sudden now, in both Jeremiah and in the Midrashim who pick up on this, now Rachel becomes this beacon to the exiled Jews. It's a major metamorphosis, but the question is, does she lose any of the baggage, or how do you integrate that baggage into it?
Well, the first interesting thing is that the idea that she's going to be there to welcome the children home, that's not in the Torah. That is only from the book of Jeremiah. So from the Torah, you don't really have that. You don't know that tradition.
Absolutely. Well, when you say the Torah, let's talk about Jeremiah for a second. So Jeremiah and Rachel, if it wasn't for this third holy spot in the world, if I had asked you who was the most important matriarch, you would go down a list. You would say Sarah. You might say Esther. Rachel is, not anything that she did was not that extraordinary. But here, maybe because of Jeremiah, where it says, Rachel weeping for her children, she refuses to be comforted. So, the question is, and it's clearly in Jeremiah's day, he was aware of the link to the exile. Jeremiah afterward wrote Lamentations. He was the Navi, the prophet of the exile. So he clearly makes the connection, does he not?
He does, for sure.
So what's interesting is not everybody bought into that connection. So last week we talked about Aramaic and the Targum, the Aramaic translation. The Targum Yonatan on that actually erases his Rachel from it and instead says Yerushalayim mivachea al baneha. He replaces Jerusalem with Rachel. He is more focused on the Ramah. Our cry is heard in Ramah, in the high place. But in some of the research that I did, Rabbi, and this was what was fascinating to me, it was saying how this growth of Rachel as this, you could almost say, like a Statue of Liberty, the Jewish Statue of Liberty, the woman who cries for her exiled children, or even cries for mothers who are having trouble having children. This developed over time. And maybe there was even a little bit of resistance to it. And maybe that's what we saw in some of those negative midrashim who were saying, in a sense, that she deserved it. But it's not clear, and you, I think, kind of intimated this when you say it's not in the Torah. This was not something that was clear in the Torah, that Rachel was to be the mother of the exiles and that her resting place was to be that beacon.
That's correct. So I think what we're really doing is we're combining two different traditions of Rachel. There's one tradition of Rachel as the beloved wife of Jacob, who kind of lives a tragic life. And she's the only one in the entire book of Genesis who dies in childbirth. When you think about that, that's a big deal to die in childbirth. Probably happened all the time in the ancient world, but we don't know about it. It's the only time in the Torah that we know about it. Isn't that interesting? Absolutely. So she's tragic. But then in Jewish tradition, in Jewish lore, in Jeremiah, this tragic figure becomes the one who's waiting for us, the one who's greeting us when we come back. That's the most beloved. She's there to give us a hug.
Yes, absolutely. So where this tradition and the pathos really takes off is, I mentioned that Jeremiah was the author of Eicha, of Lamentations. In Eicha Rabbah, the midrashic interpretation of Eicha, it has a peticha, a introduction. It's a very long introduction. Many people feel it was even added at a later date. And as the Jewish people are being exiled, one by one, all of the great patriarchs come in front of God to plead a case not to exile them. First comes Abraham, then comes Isaac, then comes Jacob. Then we go to Moses. And the source sheet on Sephira, I've included the whole text because it's full of arguments and pathos, and nothing is getting through until finally, at that moment, Rachel, our matriarch, interjected. And then she goes into a whole recounting of what she did. And fascinatingly, she changes the story that Rashi quoted earlier slightly, where she doesn't have Jacob giving her the signs. She actually gave Jacob the signs. Minor change, but again, making her more of the protagonist. And then she goes on to say, how could you exile these people? And to me, and this is a punchline that I saw that I haven't seen many of the commentaries bringing up. It says, you who are a living and eternal merciful king, why were you jealous of idol worship that was no substance? She brings up the fact that she took the teraphim, she took the household gods from her father. And she says, in a sense, why are you being so tough on my children? And that is a point that I haven't seen before, where she almost leverages the various things that she had done and maybe been criticized for, and she leverages them into an argument for her children, who, as any mother would rightly say, are not perfect. And I think this midrash is extremely famous in terms of the ethos and the history of making the tomb of Rachel into, and Rachel herself, this patron saint of the rejected and the despised and the exiled.
I think that you just set it up really nicely, and that's the question, and that is, how did she become the patron saint of the exiled, the forgotten, the exiled, and part of it goes back to the fact that we're sympathetic towards Rachel, that she loses her husband at the beginning, right? So she is the tragic figure. And she doesn't have children. Now, again, it's not all so simple, because she's obviously not as passive as all that. She takes the trafib, right? She's very much active. She's the one who basically pushes Jacob out of her father's house. Now, is she angry at her father because her father tricked her and didn't give her to Jacob? Is that why she steals the trafib? Nobody says that, but is that interesting? Right? Is that a possibility? Maybe that's why she steals the trafim.
Yes, but I would also argue, based on this midrash, and this is not an old midrash, I don't believe. I do believe it was added to Echad. What this is trying to say is that she was like saying, maybe what I did wasn't totally right. Maybe I couldn't wean myself 100% away from idolatry. But can't you excuse a God that has no substance? And if you read it in its context, it's really fascinating what her kind of argument is. That to me is a takeaway, and it gives a whole new light on the Teraphim as well. They're household gods. What's fascinating is what else happens in the later commentaries. So there's a sefer called the Sefer Hayashar, and we're talking the 1300s, and it talks about when Joseph, her son, was sold to the Midianites, and they take him out of the pit, and they're walking towards Egypt. And it's a beautiful story. I encourage you to read it in the Sephira notes. Joseph gets off of the camel when he sees the rocks next to the side of the road, and he cries. It's the first exile. Ma'aseh avot siman labanim. It's the first time we're going down to Egypt, and he cries on his mother's tomb. What's fascinating is that this identical tradition is in Islam. We had a few weeks ago where we had the tradition of Abraham visiting Hagar. Here we have another one of these parallels between Islamic midrashim and Jewish midrashim. And in a sense, it also gives us an insight into how Rachel, you were saying in the beginning that one of the reasons why we think we know, or at least there's a consensus of where Rachel's tomb is you said because Arabs come to it, Muslims come to it. When I was in Morocco, if you went to a Jewish shrine of a saint, there might be a Muslim there, and vice versa. There's this tradition of going to a holy person's grave. But what's fascinating is Rachel became almost the mother to any exile, and the pathos of the story became available for all of Abraham's children.
I think that's right. You've really done a very nice job in weaving together the different traditions of Rachel and trying to make a story out of them, even though actually in the Torah itself, that story isn't there. This story is a combination of different layers. You said something interesting when you said that the psichta, the introduction to Eicha, was later. That's what most scholars think, that it was later. Now, that's fascinating that it was later, meaning that, that was only added, that piece which turns the whole thing around, right, that was only added later. That wasn't there as part of the original.
Yeah. Yeah, it is really something that delivered over time. And there are some monographs that I read that really, until Moses Montefiore somehow was fixated. His wife was childless, and he renovated the Kever Rachel. It wasn't that big of a deal. It was almost a local shrine that people from Jerusalem would go to. There's a monograph that I quote that talks about pilgrimages, and of course, Christians went there too. There were operas that were written about this story of Joseph crying on the throne. There were paintings that were written, classical paintings that were done on this. Clearly, all of a sudden, Rachel, and I named the episode in terms of Mother Rachel Comes to Me, where John Lennon wrote about his mother Rachel, but of course we all think of Rachel, Jesus's mother. This kind of woman figure that through understanding the pains of giving birth and understanding of the love that only a mother can have for her child became this much bigger signal. And ultimately, we'll close here, and I've quoted in the notes how it was used in this opera and elsewise, but for the Zionists, the early Zionists, they also took upon Rachel, where she wasn't so much there to give osage and to give comfort to the exiles as they were departing. All of a sudden, she became a beacon to welcoming the Jews back to their home, back to the womb, so to speak. And that was the final kind of metamorphosis of it. And to me, it's a fascinating story of the history of not only an idea, the history of a personality, but the history also of a place. And if we have to make a place holy, why shouldn't it be a place where people can make the association with the love that only a mother can have?
I think that's beautiful. Thank you so much for putting this together. Shabbat shalom to everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Be well. Shabbat shalom.
Wish you all a Shabbat shalom, and see you all next week.